The air was thick with the scent of incense. Golden ornaments shimmered under the African sun, reflecting across a royal court where servants, generals, and emissaries gathered before their king. Their garments were embroidered with patterns drawn from centuries of tradition, their voices echoing in languages that carried power across borders. This was not myth, nor mere footnote to another people's story. This was the reality of Africa's ancient royalty, grand, complex, and commanding, yet so often silenced in the chronicles of history. For many of us, Africa's presence in the ancient world begins and ends with biblical references. The pharaohs who clashed with Moses, the Queen of Sheba who visited Solomon, or the land of Cush mentioned in passing. These mentions are fragments, small windows into vast and enduring civilizations that extended far beyond Scripture. To confine Africa's royal legacy to those narrow glimpses is to erase dynasties that rivaled Rome, wealth that shaped economies, and influence that redirected the course of global history. Across the deserts of Nubia, the queens known as Kandakis commanded armies against Rome, defying the might of Caesar himself. In the highlands of Axum, merchants carried ivory, spices, and gold across oceans to India and Byzantium, making their empire a hub of global commerce long before Europe's rise. In the forests of West Africa, kings presided over empires so wealthy that when Mansa Musa crossed the Sahara on pilgrimage, his generosity in gold devalued entire economies and left a legacy that reshaped maps. And in the south, stone palaces rose in Great Zimbabwe, monuments of precision and vision that confounded early explorers who refused to believe Africans could have built such marvels. These were not kingdoms defined by myth. They were centers of science, spirituality, diplomacy, and power. And yet, their stories remain faint whispers compared to the thunder of Greece, Rome, or biblical Israel. Names like Pie, Amanirenas, or Ezana are rarely taught in classrooms, though their decisions altered the balance of ancient politics. Their monuments still stand, their inscriptions still speak, but their voices are muted in global memory. Why? The truth lies not only in time's erosion, but in deliberate forgetting, erasures and distortions woven into colonial education, where Africa's past was either minimized or recast as supporting scripture rather than standing in its own right. But silence cannot erase legacy. The Nile still flows past pyramids built by Nubian kings. Ethiopian manuscripts still preserve chronicles of emperors who traced their bloodlines to Solomon, yet built their own enduring empires. The gold-laden streets of Timbuktu still whisper of scholars whose writings influenced continents. To ignore these legacies is to ignore the foundations of civilization itself. This journey will challenge that silence. In the next 20 minutes, we will step into the courts of pharaohs who were more than biblical antagonists, into Nubian palaces that ruled Egypt itself, into Axum's bustling ports that linked 3 continents, and into the golden caravans of West Africa that astounded the medieval world. We will see that Africa's rulers were not side characters in another people's story, but central actors in the human epic. Prepare to unearth Africa's royalty beyond the biblical lens. Their legacies stretch across millennia, their influence etched into stone, scripture, and memory. This is a story of power reclaimed and history finally given its rightful voice. When most people think of Egypt's pharaohs, the images that come to mind are drawn from scripture. Moses standing before Ramses, plagues sweeping the Nile, or Pharaoh's armies chasing Israel into the Red Sea. These scenes have dominated the global imagination for centuries, casting Egypt as little more than a backdrop to biblical drama. Yet Egypt's story is not one of supporting roles. It was a kingdom of extraordinary longevity, over 3,000 years of dynasties, where power, ritual, and innovation shaped the ancient world in ways far beyond the biblical lens. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was considered divine, a living God who embodied the will of the heavens on earth. His crown was more than ornament, it was a sacred emblem binding him to the gods. Temples rose not only as houses of worship, but as engines of political power, employing thousands of artisans, scribes, and priests. The pyramids, often mistaken as monuments of slave labor, were instead massive state projects that reflected unmatched organization and mastery of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. When Herodotus, the Greek historian, traveled to Egypt, he called it the gift of the Nile. recognizing that this civilization thrived through precise understanding of its environment. Each annual flood renewed the soil, and each harvest fueled a state capable of supporting armies, bureaucracies, and monumental construction on a scale the world had never seen. Yet within this grandeur lies a story often obscured: the African roots of Egypt's power and the dynasties that connected it deeply to Nubia. By the 8th century BCE, a new line of pharaohs rose not from the north but from the south, from Nubia, in what is today Sudan. Known as the 25th dynasty, these Nubian kings did not invade as mere conquerors. They came as restorers, seeing themselves as heirs to Egypt's ancient glory. King Piye, the first of this line, left behind a stela describing his unification of Egypt under Nubian rule. His words reveal a vision not of plunder, but of renewal, where Egyptian traditions were revived with fresh vigor, temples were repaired, and ancient rites honored once again. These pharaohs, Piye, Shabaka, Taharka, extended their influence across the Near East, their armies clashing with Assyria and their diplomacy reaching into the Levant. King Taharka, in particular, is remembered for monumental building projects, including the expansion of temples at Karnak and other sites. In the Bible, he appears briefly as an ally of Judah against Assyria, but that fleeting reference cannot capture his true stature. He was a king whose reign shaped politics across continents, a ruler whose influence extended from the heart of Africa to the power struggles of the Middle East. What is striking is how later narratives diminished these rulers. For centuries, Western historians resisted the idea that black African kings had ruled Egypt at all. The monuments stood in plain sight, their inscriptions carved into stone, yet their significance was downplayed, their achievements attributed elsewhere. Only with modern archaeology and African scholarship did the full weight of their legacy begin to re-emerge. Beyond the Nubians, Egypt itself was a beacon of African royalty. Queens such as Hatshepsut and Nefertiti wielded immense power, reshaping the image of rulership itself. Hatshepsut, one of the most successful pharaohs, expanded trade networks into Punt, an African kingdom whose riches brought incense, gold, and exotic goods to Egypt. Her reign was one of prosperity and stability, challenging the notion that only male rulers could sustain an empire of such magnitude. Nefertiti, immortalized in one of the most iconic sculptures of antiquity, was not just a consort but a political force who influenced the radical religious reforms of her time. This interplay of kings and queens, dynasties native and Nubian, paints a portrait far richer than the narrow biblical frame. Egypt was not defined solely by its relationship to Israel or its mention in holy texts. It was an African empire whose cultural reach extended across the Mediterranean and Near East. From its hieroglyphs, which influenced early alphabets, to its medical papyri that laid the foundation for scientific knowledge, Egypt shaped the ancient world at large. And yet, in classrooms and popular culture, Egypt is often portrayed as something separate from Africa, an anomaly, as though its greatness must be detached from the continent to make sense. This erasure is as intentional as it is damaging. To recognize Egypt fully as African is to recognize that Africa itself has always been central to human civilization. The Nile continues to flow past the ruins of Karnak and Thebes, carrying with it the echoes of voices that once commanded half a continent. The sands of Giza still guard the pyramids, not as biblical symbols, but as African monuments to human genius. To see Egypt only through the Bible is to miss the empire it truly was, an epicenter of ingenuity, faith, and power that stands as a pillar of Africa's ancient legacy. South of Egypt, along the fertile stretch of the Nile between the First and Sixth Cataracts, lay a kingdom whose legacy has too often been overshadowed. This was Nubia, home to the kingdom of Kush, an empire that rose and flourished for more than 1,000 years, commanding armies, building monumental cities, and producing rulers whose names once echoed across the ancient world. Kush was not simply a neighbor to Egypt. It was at times its rival, at times its conqueror, and often its cultural equal. The Egyptians called this land Tasseti, the land of the bow, a name that spoke to the Nubians' legendary skill as archers. Yet to reduce Nubia to warriors is to miss the fullness of its civilization. Its capital cities, first Kerma, later Napata and Meroe, were centers of royal power, religion, and artistry. Archaeology reveals temples lined with massive statues, palaces decorated with intricate carvings, and vast burial sites where kings and queens were laid to rest beneath their own pyramids. At Meroe alone, more than 200 pyramids still stand, clustered like silent sentinels across the desert, testifying to a royal tradition that was both uniquely African and globally significant. One of the most striking aspects of Kushite royalty was the prominence of its queens. Known as Kandakis, these women were more than consorts or regents. They were rulers in their own right. Roman historians record that Candace Amanirenas led her armies against Augustus Caesar himself in the 1st century BCE, forcing Rome into a peace treaty that preserved Kush's independence. Her courage and leadership made such an impression that the term Candace became a title recognized far beyond Africa. But Amanirenas was not alone. Other Kandakis, such as Amanishakito, left behind inscriptions and treasures that speak of formidable rule and immense wealth. These warrior queens embodied a model of leadership rarely acknowledged in mainstream histories. Women commanding troops, negotiating with empires, and shaping the destiny of nations. Kush was also a kingdom of innovation. While its rulers borrowed from Egyptian culture, they developed a unique identity that endured for centuries. The Meroitic script, still only partially deciphered, represents one of the earliest written languages of sub-Saharan Africa. Their art blended Egyptian motifs with African traditions, creating a style that was unmistakably their own. Figures carved with powerful physiques, jewelry adorned with intricate designs, and temples decorated with symbols that merged Amun with distinctly Nubian deities. Even their pyramids, steeper and more numerous than those of Egypt, became architectural statements of their independence. Spiritual life in Kush was equally vibrant. Amun, the great Egyptian god, was worshipped at Jebel Barkal, a sacred mountain the Kushites believed to be his dwelling place. Here, kings were crowned, blending political authority with divine legitimacy. Over time, Kush developed its own pantheon, weaving together Egyptian gods with Nubian spiritual traditions, proving that this was not a kingdom defined by imitation but by transformation. Trade further elevated Kush's importance. Positioned at the crossroads of Africa, Kush controlled routes that connected Central Africa with the Mediterranean world. Gold, ivory, ebony, iron, and exotic animals passed through their lands, enriching their courts and fueling their international influence. Kushite merchants and diplomats dealt with Egypt, Rome, Arabia, and even India, placing Nubia firmly within the web of global exchange long before modern globalization. Yet despite this strength, Kush's story has often been muted. The Bible mentions Kush, but only in passing, as though its people were shadows on the edges of Scripture. Such minimalism does injustice to a kingdom that rivaled Egypt and Rome in stature. The reality is that the kingdom of Kush was not defined by how it appeared in another civilization's records. It was a power in its own right, with rulers who left monuments, pyramids, and inscriptions to declare their sovereignty. For centuries, Western explorers and scholars dismissed Kushite remains as derivative, as though Africa could not produce greatness without Egyptian influence. But the evidence tells a different story. A kingdom that flourished for over a millennium, blending Egyptian traditions with African originality, producing queens who challenged Rome, kings who reshaped empires, and a culture that thrived long after Egypt's decline. To speak of Nubia and Kush is to restore balance to history's narrative. This was not a footnote to Egypt nor a biblical curiosity. It was an empire that stood proudly on its own terms, and its legacy, though buried beneath desert sands, continues to remind us that Africa was never silent in the ancient world. High in the Ethiopian highlands, where mountains touch the clouds and rivers carve deep valleys, rose one of Africa's most influential empires, the Kingdom of Aksum. Its legacy is often overshadowed by a single story, the tale of the Queen of Sheba, remembered in the Bible for her journey to King Solomon. Yet Aksum's history stretches far beyond that legendary encounter. It was not a mythical land at the margins of Scripture, but a thriving African empire whose reach extended across oceans, deserts, and centuries. The legend of the Queen of Sheba remains powerful. In Ethiopian tradition, she is known as Makeda, a queen whose visit to Solomon gave birth to a royal line that claimed descent from Israel's ancient kings. The Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's national epic, weaves this story into the foundation of Aksumite royalty, presenting its emperors not as imitators of foreign traditions, but as heirs to a sacred destiny. Whether taken as history, legend, or both, the Sheba narrative underscores one truth: African royalty was never peripheral. It was deeply woven into the fabric of the ancient world's imagination. But beyond legend stood the real achievements of Aksum. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Aksum had grown into a trading powerhouse. Its strategic position near the Red Sea allowed it to dominate routes connecting Africa, Arabia, and India. Caravans laden with ivory, gold, and exotic animals streamed out of its markets. In return, Aksum imported silks from China, spices from India, and wines from the Mediterranean. Greek and Roman writers described its wealth with awe, calling Aksum one of the four great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. The city of Aksum itself testified to this grandeur. Towering obelisks of carved stone, some over 70 feet tall, rose into the sky as monuments to royal authority. These stelae were not merely architectural feats. They were symbols of a civilization that understood power needed to be etched in stone, visible for generations. Even today, the ruins of Aksum stand as one of Africa's greatest archaeological treasures, reminders of a kingdom whose reach was both regional and global. Aksum was also remarkable for its early embrace of Christianity. In the 4th century CE, under King Ezana, Aksum became one of the first empires in the world to officially adopt the faith. Inscriptions from his reign record the transition from traditional gods to the cross of Christ, marking a moment of profound cultural transformation. Long before Europe's conversion, an African empire had declared Christianity its guiding faith, spreading it across the Red Sea into Arabia and deep into the African interior. To this day, Ethiopia's Orthodox Church traces its roots directly to this era, making it one of the oldest Christian traditions in continuous practice anywhere in the world. Aksum's diplomacy was as impressive as its faith. Coins minted in gold and silver carried the faces of Aksumite kings and circulated from Africa to India, proof of an economy both wealthy and sophisticated. Aksumite ambassadors appeared in the courts of Byzantium, forging alliances and shaping international affairs. At its height, Aksum was not a kingdom confined to Africa's borders. It was a world empire, recognized and respected across continents. Yet, like Kush and Egypt before it, Aksum's story is often reduced to fragments. The Queen of Sheba's visit is remembered, but the centuries of royal power that followed her are often ignored. Aksum's decline, brought about by shifting trade routes and environmental pressures, pushed its legacy into the shadows of history. Still, its influence endures, in Ethiopia's faith, in its royal traditions, and in the cultural pride of a people who remember that their ancestors once stood among the great powers of the earth. To look at Aksum only through the lens of biblical legend is to miss its true stature. This was not simply the land of Sheba. It was an empire of merchants, builders, kings, and queens who carried Africa's voice into the global arena. Aksum's story is proof that Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was already leading, shaping, and leaving marks that the world still struggles to fully acknowledge. Across the vast savannas of West Africa, kingdoms rose that reshaped the world's economy and imagination. Here, where the Sahara stretched endlessly into the horizon, caravans of camels carried salt, gold, and ivory across the desert, linking Africa's interior to the markets of Europe, Arabia, and beyond. These were not isolated kingdoms. They were empires of staggering wealth and power, whose rulers became legends across continents. The earliest of these was the Empire of Ghana, flourishing between the 6th and 13th centuries. Known as the Land of Gold, Ghana's kings controlled trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Arab chroniclers wrote of their splendor, describing kings adorned in gold and courts that dazzled visitors with their abundance. Ghana's wealth was not only in precious metals but in its strategic control of salt, a resource as valuable as gold itself in the medieval world. But Ghana was only the beginning. The Mali Empire, rising in the 13th century, carried West African royalty to heights that stunned the world. Its most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, became the embodiment of wealth itself. In 1324, he set out on a pilgrimage to Mecca, leading a caravan so vast it seemed endless. Tens of thousands of people, hundreds of camels, each carrying gold. His generosity along the way was so immense that he destabilized the economies of entire regions. In Cairo, the value of gold plummeted because Mansa Musa had given away so much of it. This single journey etched his name into global history, earning him a place on medieval maps as one of the wealthiest men to ever live. Yet Mansa Musa's legacy was not only gold. He was a builder and patron of knowledge. In Timbuktu, he established centers of learning that drew scholars from across the Islamic world. The University of Sankore and its libraries became repositories of wisdom, housing tens of thousands of manuscripts on subjects ranging from astronomy and medicine to law and poetry. These collections, many still preserved today, prove that Africa was not only a land of riches but a land of knowledge, contributing to the intellectual heritage of the world. Following Mali, the Songhai Empire rose to dominate the region, becoming one of the largest empires in African history. Under rulers like Askia the Great, Songhai established efficient systems of governance, maintained powerful armies, and expanded trade across the Sahara. Gao and Timbuktu became vibrant cities, where scholars debated theology and science, while merchants traded goods that linked Africa to Europe, Arabia, and Asia. Songhai's rulers were not simply warriors. They were administrators who built one of the most sophisticated states of their age. The brilliance of West African royalty lies not only in their material wealth, but in the balance they struck between power, knowledge, and culture. These kings were custodians of faith, patrons of scholars, and guardians of trade routes that connected continents. Their legacies challenge the shallow portrayals that reduce Africa's past to biblical shadows or colonial stereotypes. They show us a world where African rulers were central figures in the global story, commanding wealth that reshaped economies, fostering learning that influenced civilizations, and building empires whose grandeur still inspires awe. To this day, the name of Mansa Musa endures as a symbol of unimaginable riches. But his true legacy, and the legacy of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, goes deeper. It is the story of African royalty that defined an era of prosperity and brilliance. A reminder that Africa was not a silent land, but a stage upon which some of history's greatest rulers walked. In the rolling highlands of southern Africa, where rivers carved fertile valleys and granite outcrops rose like fortresses, a city of stone emerged that defied the imagination of early explorers. This was Great Zimbabwe, a royal capital whose walls, towers, and enclosures still stand as testimony to one of Africa's most remarkable civilizations. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe was the heart of a powerful kingdom that controlled trade routes stretching across the continent. Its stone architecture, constructed without mortar, formed massive enclosures, some with walls over 30 feet high, curving gracefully across the landscape. At the center rose the Great Enclosure, a monumental structure that symbolized both political power and spiritual authority. For centuries, it was a bustling royal court where kings ruled over vast lands and commanded wealth drawn from cattle, gold, and trade. Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated city. It was part of a vast network that linked southern Africa to the wider world. From its lands flowed gold and ivory, carried to coastal ports like Sofala, where Swahili and Arab merchants exchanged them for glassware, ceramics, and textiles from as far away as China and Persia. Archaeologists have uncovered shards of Chinese porcelain and Middle Eastern glass within Great Zimbabwe's ruins, evidence of a kingdom firmly embedded in global trade long before European arrival. Yet when Europeans first encountered these ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans could have built such wonders. Theories emerged attributing the structures to Phoenicians, Arabs, even biblical figures like Solomon. Such denial was not rooted in evidence but in prejudice, an attempt to erase African ingenuity. Modern archaeology, however, has confirmed what oral traditions always knew. Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, for Africans, as the heart of a thriving kingdom. From Great Zimbabwe would later emerge the Monomotapa dynasty, a kingdom that extended its influence across southern Africa. Its rulers controlled the gold fields that supplied wealth to global markets. Their power so great that Portuguese merchants who arrived in the 16th century sought alliances rather than conquest. The Monomotapa kings became key players in the Indian Ocean trade, their courts resplendent with wealth drawn from Africa's soil, and exchanged for treasures from across the seas. The legacy of these southern African kingdoms is one of resilience and grandeur. Their stone cities, gold trade, and far-reaching networks remind us that Africa's royal past was never confined to the north or the west. From Zimbabwe's walls to Monomotapa's courts, southern Africa, too, stood as a beacon of power and creativity, an empire in stone, written across the land itself. If Africa's ancient kingdoms were so powerful, so influential, and so deeply connected to the wider world, why are their stories not widely known today? The answer lies not in the failure of memory, but in the deliberate rewriting of history. When colonial powers expanded into Africa during the 19th century, they brought with them not only armies and traders, but also narratives. These narratives sought to justify conquest by portraying Africa as a land without history, a place waiting to be civilized. To sustain that myth, the grandeur of kingdoms like Kush, Axum, Mali, and Great Zimbabwe had to be diminished or erased. European explorers who stood before Zimbabwe's stone walls refused to believe Africans had built them. Scholars downplayed the Nubian pharaohs, dismissed the Kandakes as legends, and stripped Egypt of its African identity, casting it instead as an extension of the Mediterranean world. Biblical narratives were often used as the only acceptable lens through which Africa could be seen. Mentions of Kush or Sheba were allowed because they supported religious traditions, but deeper recognition of African royalty threatened the colonial idea of European supremacy. Thus, Africa's empires were reduced to footnotes, their complexity ignored, their innovations silenced. The damage of this erasure lingers today. In classrooms around the world, Africa is still often introduced only through the lens of slavery or colonization, as though its story begins with its exploitation. But the truth, uncovered by archaeology, oral tradition, and modern scholarship, is far older and far richer. Africa was not a passive backdrop to the world's history. It was a stage where kings and queens shaped global destinies. From the golden courts of Ghana to the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe, from the Nubian queens who defied Rome to the kings of Axum who ruled across seas, Africa's ancient royalty stands as proof that this continent was never silent in history. These rulers were not side characters in someone else's story. They were visionaries, conquerors, builders, and guardians of civilizations whose influence reached far beyond their borders. For too long, their legacies have been hidden behind biblical fragments or buried beneath colonial myths. But the pyramids of Meroe still pierce the sky, the manuscripts of Timbuktu still whisper wisdom, and the ruins of Axum and Great Zimbabwe still stand in defiance of forgetting. These are not relics of a forgotten world. They are reminders of a royal past that continues to shape the present. To reclaim these stories is to reclaim history itself. It is to recognize Africa not as a land waiting to be discovered, but as a cradle of kingdoms, empires, and leaders whose brilliance belongs to the world. When we speak of ancient civilizations, Africa must stand alongside Greece, Rome, and China, not as an afterthought, but as an equal. This journey has only scratched the surface. Countless names remain unsung, countless legacies waiting to be unearthed. But one truth is clear: Africa's royalty deserves its place in the grand story of humanity. If this exploration into forgotten kingdoms inspired you, subscribe to this channel for more untold histories, and like this video to share their legacy with the world. Together, we can ensure these stories are never silenced again.